Hello everyone, so welcome back to US History. So today we're starting with another video lecture to contextualize the new era that we're going to study, and this is all about how the United States started expanding westward in the early 1800s. So this is the broad picture with many steps along the way to set up how did we start to move westward so that we can go into greater depth on very specific issues that happened within this time period. So let's go ahead and jump on in, right? All right, so we need to start with understanding what was going on in our very, very early history. Some stuff that, in fact, we've already studied a little bit. So, what we need to know is that at the very beginning of our country, right when we declared our independence in 1776, Britain recognized us as being independent in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. So, when we look at what land did we have at the beginning, you can look at that map on the right there. And essentially, what happened in that treaty is Britain agreed that everything east of the Mississippi River, kind of bound by the Great Lakes in the north, and then what was Spanish Florida in the south, was now the United States. So, what you see in orange and yellow there on that map was actually the original United States, not a map that we usually associate with us. We usually think, the 13 colonies, or we think the entire North American continent as we see the map today. It's really just not true. Great Britain retained some land they had up in Canada and then down in the Caribbean Sea in the West Indies as well. And that's where they continued their American focus. But they relinquished this land, and so the US was born, right? So, just so you know for reference that when we got started as a country, we did have 13 states that came from those 13 colonies, and they are listed right there, and you can see them in that yellow color in the map. So the orange and the red and the green, those aren't going to come until later. And what's also important to notice is that while all that land in orange and yellow, kind of that goldenrod on the right-hand side, that was the United States, but the areas that's in that dark orange color were not formed into states yet. Those would come later. Some of them coming about in the next few years up until we expanded even further. So we added a few more: Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio. Notice those are mostly moving just directly west of where many Americans were already settled, which means that even by 1800, the United States was not using most of this land. I think by 1800 we can reasonably say that it was only about 1/8 of it was populated by American citizens. And so they kind of understood that there was a lot of room to expand westward. Most people were still agricultural, so having farms, growing things, selling those things they grew. And to that extent, some of the land that was gained from this initial treaty with Britain wasn't even made into states until as late as 1848. So you can see it took a long time for American citizens, really white American citizens, to start to move into this land, to occupy it, to have enough people to make it into a state that could then join the country. But that's what's kind of going right at the beginning, is very gradual growth of inching westward, as we can see on that map, because there was room to grow. All right, so what did that actually look like? Well, one of the very first things that happened, and that's why I said 1803 earlier, is we decided, even though we weren't using a lot of this land, let's expand. So the issue was that at the time, the dominant political party, the Democratic Republicans, were led by Thomas Jefferson, and he thought the future of the country was in the West, and all these Americans becoming farmers, settling this land, planting things, growing it, and that allowed all these average American families to basically live on their land, own their land, work their land, and be mostly self-sufficient. So he thought that was the ideal for the future of America. He didn't know what else would come, but that's why he wanted to get more land. Luckily for him, France was looking to basically divest from America. So France had a claim to what you see in that light yellow color on the screen right now, the Louisiana Purchase, so named after King Louis. They were looking to sell it because Napoleon wanted money to fight European wars. America was looking to buy. Initially, America just wanted to buy New Orleans so that they could control trade going into their territory. And France was like, screw it, you can have everything, because they just wanted the money. So what happened in that transaction? The United States purchased over 800,000 square miles of land for 15 million bucks. That was about $18, $19 per square mile, which, even with inflation was a fantastic deal for the time. Uh, so let's reflect on kind of what the US actually purchased, though, because it seems like, wow, what a fantastic deal, all this land for people to move into. But what were they really buying? They weren't really purchasing the land itself, because the truth is the French were not using that land. They weren't occupying it, they weren't settling it. They were just using it to say, we claim this land and we have our traders and stuff go in to trade with the natives to buy and sell things. And France just wanted that money. And so what we were really buying was France's claim to the land. So by France signing that treaty with Louisiana Purchase, they said, we'll take this money and we will say that this is not our land to claim anymore, which meant that the only ones claiming the land now were the United States, and that land was being used by the Native American tribes. So keep that in mind, that there is a difference between saying I own this land versus I use this land. And even when we bought the Louisiana Purchase, we weren't using most of the land that was already in the United States. So it was really more about getting rid of France than it was about getting a ton more land. The next step here is there had to be an effort by the government to figure out what actually was in this land. And so for the next couple years, an expedition went out there sent by Thomas Jefferson to investigate the land, to draw maps, to really figure out what was even there. I mean, for them back then, this was like going to the moon or going to Mars, of like, we know that there are resources, we have a general idea of what it's like, but we don't have maps. We don't know what's there. We don't know what problems we're going to run into. And so Jefferson sent that expedition. So it was a balance of a reconnaissance trip, trying to find a way so they could potentially trade all the way to the Pacific Ocean on the west coast, and initiating contact with the natives. Because like I said earlier, the natives were like, this is our land. And suddenly they went from the French mostly staying hands off to potentially the US coming in and being very hands on and grabby with that land in the future. And so the US government wanted to gauge what was going to be the level of cooperation and resistance when the government eventually started using the land that was really the natives' land. All right, next step is that what happened once we gained all this land? There were some international conflicts dealing with our national expansion. One happened with the War of 1812, which actually lasted until 1815, but that's just called the War of 1812. And let's set up the context for where this war came from. Where this war came from was that, Britain said, this land is yours, America, in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. But they didn't exactly leave. They had forts there that were military forts where they had the British military stationed. They also had trading posts to trade with the natives and collect resources. And they just never left. They left some of them, but they were still in there using our land for their needs. And what they also did is they understood that the US was having conflict with the Native American tribes over land. And because Britain said kind of the enemy of our enemy is our friend, they were arming Native American tribes that were at war with the United States to try and limit American national growth and prestige and power. So Britain was doing some things that they weren't supposed to be doing in this land. On top of that, they were doing stuff out on the open sea as well. So we were trying to trade over the oceans. Britain was trying to have trade over the oceans as well. And we were now competition. So what they did is they had this policy of basically coming up against American ships that were trading, typically not like, American like naval ships tied to the military, and they'd go on and they'd make these random accusations that Americans were actually escaped British sailors that they were impressing, that they were forcing and taking back into service. There was no way to prove them otherwise, and the British Navy was stronger, and this had been going on again all the way up until 1812 as well. So we had kind of some beef, some unresolved issues with our former rulers, and we went to war over it. So in 1812, the US declared war on Britain, and what we were hoping to do is end British intrusion. I guess it was brutish as well, because it was, rude and strong, but end British intrusion into American land and American affairs. And we were also thinking, hey, maybe if we win this war, we can get Canada too. We always wanted Canada, and we never got Canada. It's stupid. All right. Long story short, I'm not a big person on military history, is that Britain had the stronger military across the board. we were not prepared to fight this war. And get this, Britain was fighting against Napoleon in Europe while they were fighting us, and they still did heavy damage to us. They burned down Washington, D.C., and the Capitol and the White House had to be completely rebuilt. So, what happened around 1815? Both sides came together and said, let's just negotiate to end this war. What happened is the Brits stopped intruding, they stopped impressing our sailors, but we didn't get Canada. No land changes happened. It pretty much just got Britain out of our issues, and they promised to stay out, and they pretty much kept true to that promise after this war. So, what we had to do next, though, what the US government was considering is we kind of got Britain out of our hair, but what about all these other European powers that have colonies as well? Were they going to have an interest in intruding on our land? So, our government under, let's see, sorry, I have to do some math in my head. Under President James Monroe, issued something called the Monroe Doctrine. And essentially what this was is it was a new policy from our government. And it had a couple different balancing sides to it. So we wanted to make sure those European powers would stay out of our business in the American continents. And also it would give the chance for other colonies, we were once colonies ourselves, to become their own republics and decide their own governments. So our ideals were having independent republics from these colonial empires, and we also wanted Europe out of our business. So it fit a couple of things we were going for. So what was the policy? We basically said to Europe that stay out of our business or there will be consequences. So you can keep the land you have, but don't try to take any more. And if your colonies are trying to be independent, don't try to prevent them from becoming independent if that is the will of the people. So we kind of shook our finger at them and said, don't do this. But we were also thinking, if Europe is gone from the American continents, that could leave a void of who is the most dominant power. This guy, right? It would give us a chance to have our own sphere of influence on the other side of the world once Europe was gone. The other side of this policy was we promised to be neutral in European wars and problems. And we did this all the way up until World War II. So look at that. For almost 100 years, we said America is neutral. We're not going to get involved in other world problems because we're focusing on ourselves. And it was the balance of saying you stay out of our problems and we'll stay out of yours. So notice, these conflicts and policies, they're more about what are we going to do to secure this land instead of trying to gain more initially. We had to get Europe out of our way, and we had to have policies in place to talk about how would we deal with conflicts when they did arise. All right, we're getting towards the end here, but now that we have policies in place, we've got European powers mostly out of our hair, we wanted to figure out a way to actually move beyond the Louisiana Territory and be that manifest destiny from sea to shining sea, right? So this is where we go away from just getting more land to making national expansion a part of our national identity. And one of the places this actually starts is in Texas. Who would have thought, right? What was essentially happening in Texas is that Americans began immigrating there in the 1820s once Mexico became its own country. Mexico wanted more people to use their land and be a member of their new republic as well, and they didn't have a lot of people. So they encouraged Americans to come, saying, we'll give you free land that you can grow on. You can't have slavery. You have to convert to Catholicism. You have to promise to remain loyal to Mexico instead of the U.S., but they said you can have free land. And so many Americans did that. But what happened is by about 15 years later, Americans outnumbered like Mexicans, like people that were actually from Mexico, 10-1 in the region of Tejas, which is Texas. And so all these Americans started going, wait, so they won't let us have slaves, we have to be Catholic, but most of us are Americans, we'd rather be tied to ourselves as our identity or to our American identity and not tied to Mexico. So what Texas did is they declared their independence, just as the 13 colonies declared independence from Great Britain. They viewed it as in the same vein of doing all that. The Texans then won the war, and they actually had their own country for the next 10 years. So when we call Texas the Lone Star Republic, that's because they were their own republic for a little bit of time. There was talk all throughout this time of Texas becoming a state in the United States, but it was continually being put off because slavery was legal in Texas when it became its own republic. And there were huge concerns over slavery spreading in the US because they had like a very settled rule and they didn't want to change the rule. So it got put off and put off and put off. And then Texas finally joined about 10 years after they really could have joined. And what follows immediately after that is another important step for getting to where we are today, with the US having control of most of the North American continent, and that is a war with Mexico. So remember, Texas was fighting with Mexico, but that was Texas versus Mexico, not the United States versus Mexico. But that conflict kind of boiled over into another one once Texas had joined the United States, and it lasts for a couple years. So what happened is the US got the Texan territory, but Mexico and Texas disagreed where the border was with the United States. The US also wanted places like California and Arizona, Nevada, that whole area that you eventually see in green on the screen right there. The US wanted it. We wanted to have like one continuous path of land and really control the American continent and have our competition gone. But Mexico wouldn't sell it to us because, well, we kind of burned that bridge by letting Texas join us when Mexico was kind of bitter about Texas leaving them in the first place. So what we did, instead of just waiting it out or, accepting this isn't going to happen, is that we provoked a war with Mexico. We knew they didn't want to sell it, but what we did is we kind of poked them with a stick until they shot first. So what we did is we put our troops right on the border with Mexico. But Mexico thought the border was just a little bit further north. And so they said the US is on Mexican territory. And we said, no, this is American territory. What are you talking about? And we just sat there until Mexico fired first. And then we can say, hey, Mexico started this war. I guess we have to fight it. So the war goes through. It's almost entirely fought in Mexico itself and not on American soil. And there was actually a very, very high death rate among the soldiers. Really one of the highest among any of the wars we've been in, of those who were fighting, dying in battle. So on top of that, the war was very controversial at its own time because of that idea, like, did we start this war just to grab some land, or did Mexico start this war? People disagreed about whether it was right or not and why we were fighting the war. But we did eventually win the war, and we got what we wanted in the process. You can see everything in green there where it says the Mexican cession. That is the land that Mexico ceded, a cession ceded to give up, basically gave up to us as a result of the war. But the same problem with Texas happened again because of the Mexican-American War. And that was that we started to have this crisis over, should slavery be allowed to expand? Because suddenly we just added another third of our country size to us. And those that wanted slavery to expand were saying, well, we need to change the rules because based on the current rule, slavery won't be able to expand, and that's not fair to us. And so this reignited these debates that we're going to talk about later about whether slavery was good for the nation or bad. Long story short, it was bad. But and on top of that, whether it should expand or not, and whether it was correct that it should be expanding based on kind of that moral determination as well. So if you're looking at the map we've seen so far, you're probably like, but what about all that other stuff? What about Florida and Oregon and Washington and that orange part down there below the green part? We get this other stuff as well, and if you look at the whole map that we'll see in a minute, what you're going to see is that there's kind of these tiny places all around that were basically not very eventful, right? So the country that had it basically gave it up and said, America, you can have it, we don't want to fight over this. Or we got together with them and just signed a treaty and made a compromise out of it instead. That's what happened with Oregon. Britain got half the territory, we got half the territory. And other things where we just bought more land. So we couldn't quite get that thing called the Gadsden Purchase in that bright orange color on the screen right there from Mexico from the war. So we bought it a few years later for about the same price that we paid them for the land that's in green there. So it was very lucrative land for having a railroad go through it. There's a bunch of other minor treaties as well. Just realize that these other ones I didn't talk about, like Oregon and Florida, it's because they were fairly uneventful and gained peacefully or with the nations just giving up the lands. All right, so with that in mind, that basically gets us to our complete map, right? And this is that map you can see there. It was in pieces all across this presentation, but you're seeing it all in one there. You can see the states borders on there, right? So what make up our states in these different areas there. And different colors and sections to show what was negotiated between the powers. But sometimes, I don't know if I've said this in class before, but history is less about us just knowing the answers and about us asking the right questions. And perhaps along the way in this presentation, you were asking yourselves a few questions. And I think one of those central questions is, whose story did we just learn about? And we can look at that by kind of looking at this map, right? For me, it's on the other screen. We can see that it mentions the United States, so it's definitely our story, right? We can see Spain is mentioned for Florida. We can see Mexico is mentioned. We can see Great Britain is on there several times. And we know France is implied because of the Louisiana Purchase, even like the Treaty of Paris. So those are the stories that we're learning about, but it's mostly from our eyes, right? Because it's our story of, for you guys, westward expansion. So we want to sort of ask the next logical question, which is, which perspectives does this narrative value? We've got all these different powers involved, but because it's from the point of view of US history, it really values the American perspective over than, say, that of Mexico that lost over half their land in a couple of conflicts, right? They didn't want to lose Texas. They didn't want to lose California and all that land. And when we study sort of westward expansion as a story of progress from east to west, we study it from the point of view of us being victorious, but not really from the point of view of those who lost out. Another question to ask is, with whom did the government negotiate peacefully, and with whom did they fight? And we can see that it was a mixture of both, right? We can see we fought Mexico, right? We can see we signed treaties with Britain, especially as time went on. We signed treaties with France, with Spain. And one thing to note, too, that we're going to talk about later is ultimately which perspectives were omitted. And there's one really significant group that's omitted from this map, and that's the Native Americans. They're not reflected on here, right? Even though it was their land to control, we don't talk about getting the land from them. And we ask, who did we fight wars with? We fought a lot of wars with a lot of Native American tribes. And that leads to this question at the end, really one of the most essential to this topic. And that is, who lost land and power so that the US could gain it, right? We see the Native Americans were sort of one of the biggest groups that lost out because of our gains, but we can see it from Mexico as well, right? European powers as well. So when we look at it from this point of view of the map, it tells the story of progress. But let's change that map for a second, right? Hopefully you like my impressive technology there. This is the map of what it would have looked like if you asked the natives who controlled what land. And it looks radically different. None of the borders look the same because it was an entirely different mindset and negotiations and treaties between them instead of between these powers that were more looking to sort of make these clear-cut lines that they could write down on paper. It was about claim to the land, not physical use of the land. Lastly, we'll look at one more map here, and this one is animated for you with a GIF, and it shows you the process of the natives slowly losing control of the land, eventually replaced with, in red, the reservation system, right? And it sort of goes from where we started our era about to about 1890 or so. And what we see is a process that was fought gradually, that it never really felt for the American government that they were doing anything too horrible along the way. But the result is clear that if we ask that question, who lost so we could gain, it was mostly the Native Americans. And that's why in class we're going to look at this topic in much more depth to understand their perspective, the US government's perspective as well, but to basically see what this process was like beyond the standard westward expansion narrative that we just went over in this video right here. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. Hopefully the end kind of had some thought-provoking moments as well. So keep on watching these as they come up when you need to, and I will see you in class. Bye.